6 years ago, almost 6 years ago to the day, in fact, I was live blogging the certification of the 2020 American presidential results. We knew that there was going to be some drama because we knew that the results were going to be challenged in Congress by some Republicans. Obviously, we didn't know quite what was going to go down that day. And so I ended up live blogging the January 6th insurrection. And I go back occasionally and I look at my thread on that, and it's very long and, not all of it is particularly relevant today. But I do revisit what I said immediately in the moment, which this bit at least, I think, more or less holds up. Quote, Trump just tweeted utterly glorifying this. If he is not removed, if there are not consequences to this, it will only continue. And I more or less stand by that, and I think that is indeed what did happen. There were not consequences to this. The impeachment fizzled out. He was impeached in the House, but then acquitted in the Senate. Blame to that goes wholly to Republicans. Every Democrat voted for it. And then there were not criminal consequences. There were attempts. Some good work was done there, but those two failed, and that's why that failed is a longer story I won't go into here, but the bottom line is they did fail. And it did only continue. We have seen continuing rolling violent attacks on our constitutional order, and I would say over the last year or so, America has transitioned from a flawed liberal democracy to competitive authoritarianism. And all of that was completely predictable and obviously predictable in advance. Every regime will have enemies. No nation state will be able to get, especially a massive nation state like America, will be able to get the universal enthusiastic buy-in of everyone subject to it. There will always be people who think, well, maybe some utterly different form of government might be better. And the state has to be able to respond to that. And this isn't even like a paradoxes of tolerance type thing. I'm not talking about should people be allowed to sort of say, oh, well, in theory, an authoritarian regime might be better. People can and do say that all the time. I'm talking about, violent attempts to disrupt the core machinery of government, which is what January 6th was. No constitutional order can allow something like that to happen unanswered and expect to survive. And people, I think, minded to perhaps defend how slow-moving those attempts at consequences were, sort of say things like, oh, but you have to understand it was a very complicated legal situation, and, Merrick Garland was really focused on putting together an airtight case, and that takes time. And I think they haven't heard what people like me are saying, which is that's all downstream. A legal order, a legal and constitutional order that cannot enforce consequences for a coup is one that is failing and that will fail. And that it almost definitionally, not definitionally, it practically has to be able to do that. And if it doesn't, it's failing. So the fact that you tell me it necessarily will take 8 years, well, that just means that the order was failing and could never be expected to last, right? And as we create something new, we will have to keep all of that in mind. And that's sort of the framework I've been thinking about a lot of different things through to try and simplify down everything that's going on to this simple question of what has to happen to create liberal democracy in America. And I use the word create with some intentionality. I'm not saying return. I'm not saying preserve. There was a time, perhaps, where we could talk about protecting the underlying constitutional order from Trump. But it's gone now, and I think we just have to be reasonably straightforward and honest about that. Nor do I think return is the right way of visualizing it. For one thing, progressivism should be, well, progressive. We should be forward-looking. But for another, the old order, as I've said, was clearly incapable of meeting the challenges at the moment. We don't want to simply return to the past. The past is what brought us to the present. We need to create something new, informed by, certainly, what has been before. I'm not talking completely a tabula rasa moment, but perhaps, as many have done, something of a reconstruction. After the Civil War, some elements of the Constitution were preserved, but enough new stuff was added on. I think it's safe to say that was a new Constitution that moved forward from there. I think something like that is probably called for. And that's very much that question: how do we create liberal democracy in America from where we are now? Is how I have been thinking about the murder that just occurred in Minneapolis. I'm not going to review the case massively. I imagine you've seen it online. But essentially, an ICE officer shot a 30-some-year-old woman, an American citizen, for little to no provocation. It seems like she was getting conflicting instructions. She was in a car. One officer told her to drive on, another told her to stop and get out. And then an ICE officer or agent who was clearly in no danger whatsoever fired 3 shots at her and killed her. This is, I mean, let's just call this what it is. This was a summary execution by Trump's personal secret police. And so I want to put aside for a minute questions of immigration and immigration enforcement and police powers or anything like that. And I want to just zero in and look at it through this one lens. What has to happen to create constitutional democracy in America, to create a liberal constitutional order again here? And I think it's reasonably obvious when you ask it through that frame. ICE has to go. Root and branch, the entire agency has to be disbanded. This is not a question of a few bad apples. And I realise the few bad apples metaphor is dubious even in the case of ordinary policing, but I think here we have to understand that the institution is doing what it was set up to do. It is functioning as a instrument of violent political repression, and again, that's clearly how it was conceived of by the Trump people. There's a reason authoritarians always ramp up immigration enforcement. It is an apparatus of violent control that exists outside of the normal checks and balances, and is institutionally and culturally acclimated to see its victims as non-people. And so all you have to do when you're attempting to transition an order from liberal democracy to authoritarianism is you don't need to say, okay, now we are creating a secret police whose job is to go after dissidents. All you have to do is take this apparatus of violent control geared towards getting rid of people who, quote unquote, aren't supposed to be here, and expand the definition of people who aren't supposed to be here such that it includes domestic dissidents. And there's a pretty classic playbook there, and that's exactly what we've seen from the Trump administration. And in fact, we see now overtly they're explicitly recruiting people who are ideologically aligned. So there's some news recently that ICE are spending $100 million, which seems like quite a lot of money, to recruit people who are, for instance, gun rights enthusiasts or like part of extreme conservative groups and so on and so forth, right? So this is clearly designed to be an apparatus of violent domination outside of the normal checks and balances that doesn't see its victims as human, but one that is ideologically loyal to the MAGA movement, and I think increasingly is becoming clear, personally loyal to Trump himself. It's something like a latter-day Praetorian Guard, you could say. Well, okay then. Well, that just has to go. It, it's it's a matter of the institution itself, not any individual within it. Its continued existence is simply incompatible with any sort of liberal democratic regime we might try to create. And I'll just make a prediction. If what happens is the Democrats come to power and leave ICE in place, it will continue operating with these very ideological aims regardless. Like, it will ignore orders from a Democratic president, as in fact it did under Biden. Biden issued instructions for them to change some policies with regards to deportation, and they just kept doing it anyway. We will see that again, but on a much more serious level. It will continue its attacks on a free society and free institutions, regardless of what the nominal orders from the top are saying. It has to be disbanded. And I don't think that will be enough. I think there also has to be consequences. I think there has to be consequences for individual ICE agents who broke the law. I think this person who shot and killed this woman has to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But there also has to be consequences. There also has to be accountability. The best reaction from any Democrat on this was Ilhan Omar, who I don't always agree with about everything, but I think had the best single statement on this, which is just exactly where I'm at. She said, quote, "Abolishing ICE is not enough. They must be held accountable." End quote. And I agree with that completely, and they in the collective. We are going to need a serious criminal investigation of many of the individual instances of wrongdoing, but we're also going to need a criminal investigation of the organisation itself, of its leadership, of its higher-ups, of the decisions that were made that predictably resulted in this criminality. No future liberal democratic regime will be secure with ICE still existing. But I'm not even sure they'll be secure with ICE disbanded and the worst perpetrators unpunished. Because I think all that will happen then is that then at some point there'll be another Republican president, they'll set something up like this again, and we'll be back here. We're in a disequilibrium right now, where when we're under a criminal Republican presidency, people don't have to fear consequences for law breaking, either in the moment or under a potential future Democratic president. But under a Democratic president, people have to fear consequences for law enforcement from a future Republican president. Look at all the people who got fired for their role in the January 6th investigation, or the documents case in Mar-a-Lago, or the purges that have happened within the military. So we just have a really warped set of incentives right now, where if you want to try and take part in a fascist conspiracy to bring liberal democracy down, you have nothing to fear. So, like, you might as well give it a go. But if you want to try and restore liberal democracy, or maintain liberal democracy, you actually do have a certain amount to fear. And that is just not a sustainable set of incentives. Some conservatives might have foregone the chance to take down liberal democracy when they wanted to, and certainly some on the liberal side have shown great courage in the face of the disincentives that we face. But ultimately people respond to incentives, and we just have to be real about that one. And you show me the incentives, I will show you the outcome. And at the moment, those incentives point us towards a particular outcome, and so those incentives have to change. I don't think it's enough to just get rid of them. I think there has to be consequences. Not as a matter of vengeance, though I don't begrudge people who feel retributively here. Not even as a matter of justice, but as a matter of the survival of a type of social and political order which is far, far superior, for all its failings, is far, far superior to the alternatives. Again, just looking at this through the narrow question of what has to happen for a liberal democratic order to be created in America. I'll also add, universal rule of law is a key feature of liberalism. This is one of the core foundation pieces of the worldview. As I just said, one of the defining features of competitive authoritarianism, which I said is, I think, the regime type we're under now, is that there's still elections, there's still different factions, but the rules of the game both are very clearly weighted towards one side, both the electoral rules, but also the legal rules. The non-dominant faction has to follow the law, and perhaps even as a sort of exaggerated form of the law imposed on it, whereas the dominant faction has a much lighter form of the law imposed on it, or indeed is functionally lawless, which is, what we're seeing in America right now, which is why I feel confident to label it as competitive authoritarianism. That non-universal application of law is both a cause and enabler of competitive authoritarianism and one of its defining features. So restoring universal rule of law is part of what it will mean to create liberal democracy in America. It's both something that has to happen to enable liberalism, but it also is just what liberalism entails. Being in a liberal regime is that you can't just shoot people in the street. Trump famously once said he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and get away with it. We're now looking at a regime that claims the right for any of its partisans to shoot any of its opponents in the street and get away with it. That is their open assertion. That is the power that they have aggregated to themselves. And this is one of the things that I think basically everyone on our side has to get behind. I think there's not a massive number, but a few. I think the anti-fascist coalition in America is a vast and unwieldy thing. There are many different perspectives, from centre-right to out-and-out communists and anything and everything in between. We are going to disagree, and that's okay. But I think there needs to be some core things that we are all on board with, because we cannot have a Biden 2.0. And I say this as someone who found much to praise in the Biden administration. And, from a policy perspective, I liked a lot of the directions they went. I have good things to say about their legislation. But as a matter of preventing fascism returning, they clearly failed, right? And we need to grapple with that failure. We can't just assume that we'll take power again and everything will sort of sort itself out. It clearly won't. As I've said, the incentives are clearly just at the moment not compatible with a return to liberal democracy. So I think there's a certain set of things that we just need everyone to put their name to. So some sort of court reform, I think, is one of them. Any path that leads to the creation of a true liberal democracy in the United States runs through the current Supreme Court. So that's one. And I think the abolition of ICE and consequences for this illegality are another. And I think that framing about what has to happen for the creation of liberal democracy kind of bypasses concerns about persuasion and about electability. Because particularly when it comes to immigration, there's been this long-running argument, which I've been a part of, about can we sell electorates on a pro-immigration vision, or do we need to just compromise and sort of offer nativism light, right? I certainly have my perspectives there. That's my last article, in fact. But even if I'm wrong about that debate, those electability type arguments still are not applicable here. So, what someone might say to give the challenge is, look, I understand you don't like ICE, Toby, and I agree, it seems like they've done some very bad things. But what you have to understand is that the average voter is very concerned about immigration. They think it's too high. They think illegal immigration is destroying the country and raising crime rates. If you run on abolishing ICE, you will lose. And if you are concerned about fascism and Trump and so on, then you have to put something before the electorate that they'll go for, because they're not going for this. That's the retort, right? To which I say, then we have already lost. If we cannot end this agency and enforce consequences, we will not create liberal democracy in America. We have to work backwards from that. And you might say we'll never win an election on it. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that that's true. I actually think with the increasingly horrific consequences that we're seeing, I think the time is right for robust counter-messaging. Certainly a majority of Democratic primary voters, agree with ending ICE. And I think swing voters will go along with it if they're sick enough of the current regime, which it looks like they are. But if I'm wrong, then we're just doomed anyway, so we might as well fight. You might not win, but at least fight. And I think the reality is, the situation is so unprecedented that we simply don't know where the electorate's going to be at in a year or 3 years from now and what they might go for. But the idea that we cannot run on this because it's unpopular, whatever its merits, and I think actually those merits are dubious right now, but whatever its merits, is essentially tantamount to accepting defeat. If we cannot get rid of ICE, we cannot create liberal democracy in America. Now, maybe there's a possibility where, like, we go in with, like, a secret plan to do it. We just don't tell the electorate about it. I'm pretty skeptical of that. Not just for, like, ethical reasons of, like, don't lie to the electorate, but I think everyone needs to have their name down as backing it for it to happen. I think if we get in without a plan, it won't happen. I think if we get in without everyone... I think if we get in the next election, Democrats return to power in 29. And there's this vague idea that we're going to reform ICE, but not specifics. I think what we'll get is sort of like a bill that, you know, does put some oversight in, does do a few things, but then is just completely ignored by the agency on the ground. Or perhaps nothing. Perhaps we won't agree to anything. So I think, not just as a matter of getting a mandate and creating momentum, but just as a functional matter of doing the thing, we kind of need everyone signed up to this in advance. And this is what you saw from the Biden administration in their first 2 years of power, that Nancy Pelosi, who I actually rate quite highly as a politician, had spent a lot of time prepping. She knew they'd be coming in with a small majority, and had spent a lot of time doing these sort of signalling votes of putting something up they knew would never go through or be signed by Trump, but just to get everyone locked in as we know that they'll vote for it. And the things that they did get everyone locked in for, they were able to pass. And the things that they sort of went in with a more vague plan, they weren't. So I just think we have to have everyone locked in on this. And I think having everyone locked in will have a further advantage in that there's a lot of pain coming over the next few years. This will get worse. And while I don't discount the possibility of the regime just collapsing, we're not at that point yet. Um, I think if we very clearly and credibly signal that there will be consequences, we might be able to some degree, mitigate wrongdoing now. People are behaving so badly, so just evilly, that because they rationally do not fear consequences, they don't think anything is going to happen to them for executing civilians. And in some ways, they're correct to think that, right? Like, the Republican administration and Justice Department certainly is not going to hold them accountable. But, what could we really expect from Democrats 4 years from now? So I think we have to signal that there will be, not just like, oh, we'll do an investigation. No, there has to be consequence. And to the extent that we can, we have to just enforce the law now. Like, I know we're under competitive authoritarianism, but murder is still illegal, right? Can a Democratic DA not arrest the person who did this? And I kind of don't want to hear about the reasons that can't happen. I'm sure there's all sorts of legal complications. My response would be get the cuffs on, work it out as you go. Like, again, a regime that can't arrest people for murder is a regime that has failed, a legal regime that has failed, right? If you tell me, oh, there's X, Y, Z reasons why that can't happen, you're making an argument for a much more comprehensive program of legal reform, a much more radical program of legal reform than anything I'm advocating for here. So if you're making that argument, fine, but make your consequences explicit. Don't just like put it forward as like, here's why we can't do it. So anyway, that's my case for why, in broad terms, I think we have to go for abolition and accountability. And I think everyone has to be on board with that. Like, realistically, we're going to need like 95% of the Democratic caucus sold on this, right? Even assuming we win big, and I'm not assuming that in the next few election cycles. Here's the challenge, though. I said there's going to be a certain set of things that I think we are going to have to get the anti-fascist coalition cohered on. I think this one is the most challenging. Even something like court reform, I think, is becoming something like the majority position in the Democratic caucus. Basically, everyone's sort of signaled some openness to some sort of reform. I'd like to get everyone at least to court packing, which they're not yet. That's probably more like a 50-50 thing. But that is swinging our way, certainly relative to, say, the 2020 election, where even that was still viewed as quite a radical thing. That's shifted a lot. There's been a lot of criticism of ICE. There's been a lot of talk of oversight and reform. The abolition and accountability is still a much, much, much more minority position within the Democratic caucus. And so here's where we get into a debate about how we should engage with the Democratic Party and how we should talk about the Democratic Party and talk to the Democratic Party. So on the one hand, there's sort of a position that says, for the most part, mainline Dems are not meeting the moment. They need to fight, and they're not. And when you look at their messaging around this, it is hopelessly weak. Like, they are treating this like a normal political time, and it is not. And screw them, essentially, right? On the other side is a position that says, well, what do you expect them to do? Voters handed them none of the levers of power. They control none of the three branches of government. The minority party has maybe some stalling tactics, but really not much. Like, instead of spending all your time at yelling at Democrats, why don't you yell at the people causing all the problems? And then people will say, oh, but, the Republicans aren't going to listen to us. And the retort is, well, no, Republicans aren't. But the people who are just tuning in, the more apathetic, the less political, the undecided, if they just hear Republicans yelling at Democrats and Democrats yelling at Democrats, what are they going to think? Like, we need to present our side of the case. And then the other side would say, okay, but I hear that, but they're also really kind of not meeting the moment. Like, have you seen these guys? And I think most people intuitively feel that there's a middle path there. At least that's where I'm at. And my sort of middle path is, I think a lot of times this debate can become factional and it can become vague. It can sort of be this general thing about, like, how do I feel about the Democratic Party and do they express who I am? A lot of the sort of more abstract debates that sort of go into, like, for instance, the left abstention debate and stuff like that. And I think we need to go the other way and really focus on specifics. Like I say, I think the way to think about this is there's going to be a handful of things, perhaps no more than half a dozen, on which the anti-fascist coalition, inclusive of the Democratic Party, is going to have to cohere on. I sort of have my list, and I sort of fleshed that out in the video episode titled "It Will Be Worse in the UK." The title's about the UK, but the first third of that episode is about America. I sort of went through sort of what I think that would look like. I'm not claiming I have all the answers here, and it's obviously going to have to be a consensus decision. So, if we end up with a list that's not exactly my list, then, fine, I'll go with sort of what the collective wisdom is here. But while we are still sort of working it out, I would like to offer my 2 cents, and as I've said, I think abolition and accountability for ICE, I think it kind of has to be on that list. But I think that's how we engage with Democrats. I think it can be a bit vibes-based, of like, oh, Chuck Schumer kind of has weird, weak vibes about him, but Mandami, we like him, he has, like, charismatic vibes or something. I think it wants to be specific things that any Democrat can sign up to, that are black and white, whether or not they have signed up to it, and we can sort of engage with them on that basis. So, for instance, we've had a lot of, I think actually quite decent, to be fair, condemnations of this from leading Democrats in the 24 hours since it's happened. I think we can say, and if you look at my Blue Sky feed, you will see me saying either great job, I commend you for calling for criminal consequences and ending ICE, or me saying, I appreciate the condemnation, I would like to see you go further and call for ending ICE. I think it can be just a very, like, checkbox, paint by numbers, really zeroing in on the specifics, and I think that gets us away from this abstract debate about, like, are Democrats meeting the moment? Because, like, I think critics of that phrase would correctly say, well, what does that even mean, right? And so I think to the extent we do want to move Dems, we can't just sort of talk in abstractions. We have to put forward, these are our bullet points. And then that should inform, not just how we post with them online, although, that is one form of lobbying, but what we're asking when we write to our representatives, what we're asking if we ever get the chance to engage with them in person. It should be really clear so that they don't walk away from that meeting or phone call or even online interaction, sort of just with this vague sense that their constituents are angry at them. They have a very clear sense of they want you to adopt this position. And I'll be clear, I'll be honest, I don't even really care if it's sincere. Like, I think people say, oh, Dems say stuff, but they don't do it. Nah. Like, the mark of, as I say, the mark of if something's going to happen is if you have the entire caucus pledged to that position and having taken messaging votes on that position before you come to power. Not absolute guarantee, but, like, that is a pretty big difference that makes a difference there. And I think, we can't assess a Democrat's internal motives. You might have the feeling that they're pretty slippery and not to be trusted and fine, but, that's just going to devolve back into this kind of more abstract debate. I think it needs to be Did they say X, Y, and Z? Yes, great. Or no, you have some work to do. And then that should inform and explicitly and self-consciously inform how we cast primary votes. Both for like when we get to the Democratic primary, that is going to be, whatever sort of list we come to, that is going to be my main voting criteria. Explicitly so. And I think it should be yours too. But, for all the down ballot races, like, are they endorsing this checklist? And I think the accountability and abolition of ICE is not the only thing on that checklist, but it's sort of one of my 5 or 6 things I think has to be on that checklist. And I think that should just be a much better way of engaging with the Democratic Party, and I think that avoids the liabilities, on the one hand, of not pushing them to be more aggressive, but on the other, of just kind of yelling at them no matter what and not really offering anything constructive. I'll end with this. I think the reason Democrats have been scared to take the Abolish ICE label is I think they associate it in their heads with defund the police, which is something the caucus really feels strongly about. Feels strongly against, I should clarify, in that Democratic electeds hate that slogan because a lot of voters have taken it to mean get rid of policing entirely, which isn't quite what advocates of it meant. They more meant like some policing functions need to be outsourced to other groups and so on and so forth. But as Democrats would say, and I think to be fair correctly on this one, if you're explaining, you're losing. If you have to like explain what you meant by your slogan, it wasn't a good slogan. And, I'm not precious about these things. I believe in police reform, but like, if that slogan hasn't landed, then it hasn't landed, and I'm not going to fight for it. But that was one that, like, I think the Democratic Party became really, really leery of, and they really hated that they were being defined by it, and they kind of wished everyone saying it would shut up. And, I don't think they can ask for that latter part. Like, activists are going to say what they're going to say, but my feeling is the average Democratic congressman or woman really just hates that slogan. And I think they associate abolish ICE with that, like get rid of law enforcement. And I would really want to say 2 things to them, if any Democrats are listening. Those are not the same things, and I think they are obvious. If you look at polling on them, I think they're obviously not landing with the electorate as the same things. I think if the entire Democratic Party, from Biden on down, took defund the police as their slogan, I can see that might have negative consequences. I think if you made abolish ICE a slogan, part of our platform, it wouldn't be anywhere near as bad, and perhaps even positive. I think all of the Democratic Party base would rally behind it easily. And I think the difference that makes a difference is policing, for better or worse in America, is still held in quite high regard. People understand that there are problems with the police, but if you look at polling, it still has a fairly high bipartisan approval overall, and people see it as a bipartisan institution. People don't see police as like a Republican or Democrat thing. That is not true of ICE. ICE is now increasingly explicitly identified with Trump, and people who do not like Trump, which is a majority of the country, I think will rally behind the messaging of get rid of Trump's secret police. And I think that's how we should talk about it. And if people say, oh, well, but what we need immigration enforcement, does this mean you're weak on immigration? That's not the conversation we're having. That's not what ICE is doing. ICE is acting as a brutal authoritarian secret police that is shooting American citizens, and they have to go, and they have to be held accountable for that. If you want to be cautious, you can say, we'll put something else in its place. Fine, we'll have that disagreement down the road, right? I would probably disagree with that take, but, that's a sort of reasonable distinction we can have. But actually, you know what? Honestly, I think people are ready. I don't think you have to do this yes but thing that Democrats continually find themselves in, of saying, look, of course I agree we need to enforce immigration, of course we need to have a strong border, but ICE isn't quite the right way to do that. I think you can say, and I've just written on this, nativism has failed. The idea that we make our country stronger by excluding others, by throwing up walls, has failed. It might have sounded good in theory, but we have seen the consequences of it. The UK economy is on its knees because it has followed nativist delusions. Hospitals are overflowing. The average Brit is 10% poorer. In America, we have seen the authoritarian consequences of that worldview. We've seen the idea that to purge and purify a society, what that will really take and look like in practice. We have seen concentration camps and masked men on the street. We have seen summary executions of American citizens, and not just those results, but the mindset that led to those results has to be rejected, and that we need something new, and that we should be a society that welcomes newcomers and welcomes difference. And that is part of America, and it is part of the greatness of America. I don't know about you, but that latter message sounds a bit more forceful and compelling than, well, we need immigration reform. But I think we're ready. I think we're ready to fight back. And I think when we do, we'll find the forces arrayed against us to be much weaker than we initially supposed. But even if you're not willing to follow me all the way there, even if you'd like to retain a more cautious messaging, the abolition of ICE and the accountability for wrongdoers is a non-negotiable. That is essential if we are to create liberal democracy in America, and I think that has to be one of the core demands that we make of the Democratic Party, and one of the part of the consensus for reconstruction that the anti-fascist coalition coheres around. Thank you for listening.